Hello and welcome to Open Classroom, the Brown School's digital forum for community and conversation. My name is Sarah Sims. I am the manager of continuing education here at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's program, which is a part of our curriculum showcase series. Before we get started, I would like to do just a couple of brief housekeeping items. The first is that we are using a Zoom webinar format, which basically just means that we can't see or hear you, but we do still really want to engage with you via the chat, which is open to everyone. So right now, feel free to say hello, say where you're joining us from, and then throughout the program, you can leave any comments, and then we definitely encourage your questions, which we will be fielding to our presenter at the end. The second piece is that we are also live streaming on YouTube. I will in just a moment here drop a link to that in the chat. So if anyone you know didn't get to register ahead of time, you can share that with them and they could watch. However, we're not able to moderate the Q&A in the YouTube chat. So just be aware of that. So now I would like to welcome and introduce my colleague and the facilitator for today, who will introduce the program and the speaker, Sarah Birch, who is the Associate Director of Admissions and Recruitment for the Brown School. So Sarah, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Sarah Sims shared, my name is Sarah Birch, she, her pronouns, and I am with the Office of Admissions and Recruitment. On behalf of my office, I would just like to thank the professional development team for partnering with us once again on the curriculum showcase series, which we really hope gives our viewers a little glimpse on the curriculum offerings of the Brown School's graduate level degree programs. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Kim Johnson is a cancer epidemiologist with over a decade of experience conducting cancer research. She is an associate professor at the Brown School and the chair of the Epidemiology and Biostatistics specialization for the Master of Public Health program. Her experience includes designing and managing projects, collecting and organizing data, conducting analyses using a number of different statistical tools, supervising staff, mentoring students and trainees. She does it all. And so today, as part of our Brown School Curriculum Showcase series, Dr. Johnson will be providing an introduction to the field of epidemiology with an overview of the field's historical origin, leading to modern day cause and effect thinking that is applied to identifying risk factors for health outcomes. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Kim.
Thanks a lot. It's my pleasure to be here and to share a little bit of what I know about epidemiology with you today. So I'm going to share my screen. Can we see that?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Move things around a little. Okay, so I'm just going to pretend you're a first year MPH student. I'm going to give you a little flavor for what our students receive in our program, at least from me, on their first day of class. Okay, so our learning objectives for today are first and foremost to have fun, because I believe that when you're having fun, you learn more and you retain more. Be able to define epidemiology, distinguish between descriptive and analytic epidemiology and explain the importance of each. Understand the core assumptions of epidemiology. Understand and be able to apply several different models for causal thinking, and understand how epidemiologists make conclusions about risk factors for health outcomes. So I'm going to start off with a little epidemiology short story. Then I'm going to tell you what exactly is epidemiology. It's a mouthful. I think everybody's aware since the COVID pandemic what it is, but hopefully you'll have a better appreciation for what we do. And then we're going to move into why we are here. So it's not, it's a big question, but it's an introduction to how, a little bit about how epidemiologists think about causal thinking. And then we're going to finally wrap up with evaluating evidence for causality using something called Hill's guidelines for assessing causation. Okay, so epidemiology has its origins a long time ago with scurvy. This is one of my favorite epidemiology stories, and it's about James Lind. He is credited for the first planned controlled clinical trial. Okay, so he wrote a treatise in 1753 about life in the 18th century Navy. And in that treatise, he says the number of seamen in time of war who died of shipwreck, capture, famine, fire, or sword are but of inconsiderable in respect of such as are destroyed by the ship diseases and by the usual maladies of intemperate climates. Who was James Lind? He was, most of our forerunners in epidemiology came from England and Great Britain, and he was actually a Scottish physician who lived from 1716 to 1794. And he was the ship's doctor on the HMS Salisbury when he did this experiment. So for those of you who are not familiar with scurvy and the symptoms, as you probably would not be because it's not very common these days, it presents with lethargy, irritability, weight loss, aching of the joints, bleeding under the skin and nails, swollen and bleeding gums, spontaneous bruising, and wounds that are slow to heal. And fun fact, I think it is humans and guinea pigs, who sadly we found out with our own guinea pig, are two organisms that cannot produce vitamin C by themselves and can get scurvy. So the typical diet on the HMS Salisbury was a pound of cheese biscuits, a gallon of beer, salted beef, because back in those days they did not have refrigeration, so everything was heavily salted, 2 ounces of dried fish and butter, and then some peas. So what you'll notice is missing here are any sort of fruits. And this is a description of his study population that he published in his treatise. And he says, on the 20th of May, 1747, I selected 12 patients in the scurvy on board the Salisbury at sea. Their cases were as similar as I could have them. They all in general had putrid gums, the spots of lassitude with weakness in their knees, and they lay together in one place, being a proper apartment for sick in the forehold. Think for a minute, he has 12 patients. How would you test the effect of a dietary supplement on scurvy? And he actually had 6 dietary supplements or in a control group that he wanted to test. So to think about how you would do this so you can get good results. So some of you might think you might randomize these patients to the different diets and to minimize variation between the different patients. And so the dietary supplements, what he gave these patients was the usual diet plus quart of apple juice daily, 25 drops of elixir vitriol, which sounds terrible, sulfuric acid and aromatics. Sounds like that might kill a person, actually. 2 spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times a day, a concoction of herbs and spices, and 2 oranges and 1 lemon daily. And then his control group, which also sounds terrible, was a half a pint of seawater daily. So these were his results. The most sudden and visible good effects were perceived from the use of the oranges and lemons. One of those had taken them being at the end of 6 days fit for duty. The other was best recovered of any in his condition and being now deemed pretty well, was appointed nurse to the rest of the sick. So pretty clear results in 2 of the subjects that received the oranges and lemons. So here's a timeline about scurvy, which we never hear about anymore. This was already known way back in 1601, where James Lancaster, I think he was another British sea captain, records lemon juice as protective against scurvy. And then in 1744, over 100 years later, the British Admiral George Anson completes a trip around the world, and over half of the sailors died from scurvy. So obviously didn't receive the memo from earlier in history from James Lancaster. And then it was in 1747 where Lind did his experiment, and then took several years. Those of you working on dissertations sometimes can relate to this, but he publishes a treatise of the scurvy in 1754. And then James Cook completes his historic voyages. Sailors remained free of scurvy, so he must have known about this. The British Navy finally, in 1795, just supplies a daily ration of lime or lemon juice. And then in the United States, it was found in 1932 that vitamin C was the cause of scurvy, but it wasn't isolated until the 1900s. The problem, so there was nothing, no social media, no telephones even during this time to pass along this information about what was known rather quickly. So nowadays, this would be immediately known, these types of results to the scientific community and the public, most likely. So oftentimes in history, we discover preventative measures before we discover the causal agent. So you don't have to know necessarily what causes something in order to remedy it. So these are just some examples from history. Okay, so now we have our first quiz. So you're in class, so we give quizzes. These are not graded quizzes, but why is it important to have similar treatment and control groups? And I'm going to activate this quiz. And you'll have a chance to respond if you would like to. Okay, so it looks like the winner is both B and C, which you're correct, and no one answered A, which is increased variability between groups. It's really hard to study humans. So our goal with our epidemiological studies is to minimize variability between groups as much as possible. We can easier do that in the lab with cell culture or other sorts of experiments, but it's difficult with humans. And one way we do that is to randomize subjects to experimental treatments or control groups. So, yes. Okay. I'm just gonna show you the results. Just had one person select A. Okay. All right. So the second part, some of you may be wondering what exactly is epidemiology. I think since the COVID pandemic, a lot of us have a better appreciation. But I used to get asked this question all the time when I was in school and telling people I'm training to be an epidemiologist. They would ask me if that had something to do with the skin, or that's the epidermis, or insects. No, that's entomology. So they weren't really sure. So hopefully after this lecture, you'll have a better idea of what it is than even you got with the COVID pandemic. So this is my favorite definition of epidemiology from a dictionary of epidemiology in 2001. I think it captures everything we do. It is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified populations and the application of this study to control of health problems. So first we study, we start out with descriptive studies just to understand where disease and health outcomes are occurring in a population. And then we design, and we get data from many public databases to do this type of work. And then we design studies to understand why certain people have more or less health problems. And our goal really is to find modifiable determinants of health outcomes. So those things you can change, like exercise or what you're eating. And then we use this information, this scientific information, for prevention and control of health problems. So we want to both prevent disease from occurring in the first place, and if someone has a disease, we want to reduce morbidity and mortality to the extent possible. Okay, so the core assumptions for epidemiology are that health outcomes are not randomly distributed in the population. There are measurable factors that influence health outcomes and their underlying causes. So an example of this is shown, this is the geographic distribution of Lyme disease in the United States in 2012. And you can see that it's not randomly distributed. And if you didn't know anything about Lyme disease, just this map would be informative that something, a causative agent perhaps is clustering within these northern states, especially, and to some extent southern states, but mostly on the coast. The other assumption that makes the job incredibly interesting and frustrating at the same time, it's always like, if you like puzzles, I say that you might want to be an epidemiologist because the causes of health outcomes are multifactorial. It's not simple, especially with chronic disease. There are many routes for an individual to develop a particular health outcome. And these multiple factors interact to create an environment in which better or worse health occurs. So just the little picture here, some example might be your genetics interact with your environment, and even epigenetics to produce some sort of worse or better health outcome. Okay, so now we have our second quiz. I think this one's a little harder. I am going to share it and I will read it. Okay, older people are more likely than younger people to have complications from influenza. This is an example of okay. Just let that go for another minute. Okay, so the answer is, well, let's just go through this. A health outcome that is randomly distributed in the population. Complications from influenza in older people would be a non-random distribution of complications from influenza in the population. So A is incorrect. You have to read that a little carefully. A health outcome that is not randomly distributed in the population is correct. And age is a factor that affects complications from influenza is also correct. So the answer is E, B, and C. And here are our results. So most people selected at least one of the correct answers. Okay. All right, so we're already on part 3. So why are we here? An introduction to causal thinking. So this talk gets a little bit progressively harder because causal thinking is difficult. But a key problem for epidemiologists is, how do we know when something makes a difference and why does it matter? So we've all heard association is not equal to causation, or correlation does not equal causation. Because two things occur together does not mean that one caused another. So for example, a lot of times people, recently I've just had this thought as I read various things, people attribute something that happens right after they get a vaccine to the vaccine. Well, people have heart attacks or strokes or other things that happen to them every day. And sometimes they just happen to occur right after a vaccine, for example. That doesn't mean that the vaccine caused that event. It doesn't mean that it didn't cause that event. We need to study that. But that's an example of a potential misattribution of causality that happens all the time. So we're really interested as epidemiologists in causation and puzzles. So we've got a lot of difficult puzzles to work on. So it's a very fulfilling job if that's the type of aptitude you have. All right, so here's one of my favorite examples of correlation is not causation. So here's a graph of polio rates and ice cream sales in 1949 with the month of the year on the x-axis and the polio cases and ice cream sales on the y-axis. And so you can see a striking parallel between these two trends for ice cream sales and polio cases. So it would be natural to think, if you didn't know anything about the causes of polio, that something in ice cream might be causing polio. And this indeed did happen, and I'm going to play a little video that describes this story a little better than I can from Freakonomics. So we'll see if you can see it. We'll have to watch a tiny ad, but I will keep that as short as it allows me to. Can we see that?
You're remembering the Windsor.
We can hear it, but we cannot see it.
You cannot see it. Okay, we're going to start over then. I knew this just might happen, so we will just do a new share. And oops. All right, let me stop sharing for a second. Sorry, this worked when I was practicing. It worked one time and then it didn't work the second, or it worked the second time, but not the first time. Okay, so we'll do a new share.
Say, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. So, you know, it's lots and lots.
You can see it now?
Run, play, and jump.
Yep.
But did you know that there are some boys and girls who can't run and jump and play? It's all because of a thing called polio.
When I think of bad historical assumptions about correlation and causality, I think of polio 100 years ago, when it was this horrible mystery that it was, you know, claiming a lot of lives, and it was really scary because it mostly struck children. And there was a strong line of research that suggested that ice cream caused polio, that ice cream consumption caused polio.
Here comes it's not you get from it.
The reason that that correlation was thought to be causal was that polio spiked in the summertime for reasons that really weren't very well understood, but it did. And ice cream sales spiked during the summertime. So these researchers had seen that whenever there was a lot of ice cream being sold and consumed, there was a lot more polio. And so there was really literally the beginnings of this kind of ice cream persecution to try to stomp out polio. And it sounds ridiculous, but you see it all the time now, people trying to fight against or build up something that they're sure is connected to something else, in which it turns out just isn't.
Okay, so that's why we need epidemiologists, in my opinion.
I'm Adrienne Hill, and welcome back to Crash Course Statistics. Today, we're talking about relationships.
I will quit
No,
that.
like-
We want to get back to our talk. Okay, so I'm going to share again. All right, can we see that now?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. And Zoom is actually giving me a little notice that people can now see it. So I think that's a very striking example of where correlation and causation are mixed up. And I think we still see that a lot today as well with various especially when something is new. Okay, so development of theories of causation for epidemiology. I'm going to start way back historically. People used to attribute bad things to divine retribution in the Middle Ages. It was the wrath of God. Sometimes you might still hear that expression when you can't explain something. It must be the wrath of God. And then in the 19th century, there was the miasma theory, where disease was transmitted by miasmas, or clouds clinging to the Earth's surfaces, and identified through the foul smell. And that was before public sanitation. And so, you can understand why that might be natural to think that something in the smell might be causing various diseases. And then in more modern times, with the development of the microscope, there was the germ theory of disease and the Henle co-postulates. And then we really get into theories that I believe are squarely in the field of epidemiology, with the epidemiologic triangle, simple causal chain, web of causation. And my favorite, which is often not the student's favorite, is the Rothman causal pi model. And then another favorite is number 8, which is social ecological models, or systems thinking. And I'm going to go through each of these briefly. Okay, so Coe's postulates in 1890, and this coincided in the time when microscopes were invented, was that the microorganism is found in abundance in all diseased but not healthy organisms. So that was one postulate that had to be fulfilled for microorganisms that cause a particular disease. You can isolate the microorganism from a diseased organism, and this is depicted on the figure on the left in 2A and 2B, and grow it up in pure culture. And then it should cause disease when you inject it into a new poor rat that is healthy. And then when isolated again from the inoculated rat, the diseased experimental host causes identical disease in the new animal to the original specific causative agent, which can be confirmed by growing it up in culture and looking at it under the microscope. So that was the first thing, and this works particularly well for bacteria and things that you can see under the microscope. And then there's the epidemiological triangle, which had popularity for a while. I think it's more complicated than this, and people recognized it. This worked particularly well for vector-borne diseases, or diseases carried by different organisms, for example, malaria. And this one argues that things interact together. So there's host factors that make one susceptible to disease, like genetic or immunology or other characteristics. There's environmental factors. So for malaria, it's only found in very warm climates. And so that can be a factor. And then the agent here is the Plasmodium species that actually is the cause of malaria, but it's transmitted by only a certain type of vector, which or a certain type of mosquito that is found in certain type of environments. So this is a little more complicated, thinking about how things interact together to produce disease, but it's still not very satisfactory, especially for chronic diseases. So then another advancement was a simple causal chain where you're exposed to something else happens. So for Netflix binging, weight gain, and then diabetes, that's really an oversimplification, as you might imagine. And many factors act in each part of the causal chain to positively or negatively influence whether an outcome develops. So we know that that's not the way things usually occur, but this was just the start of our development of causal theories. We know that if you eat a Egg McMuffin, that doesn't necessarily imply that you'll be in bad shape, similar to a donut, or if you eat a banana, that you'll be in good shape. So that's an oversimplification. So it gets really complicated into thinking about how all the factors and developing a model that can help explain how all the factors come together to produce disease in a person. So another way that people have thought about it is a web of causation. So it's a paradigm for the causes of chronic diseases, and it embodies the idea that multiple causes that come together over a person's lifetime to cause disease. And it's illustrated here, and we actually use this and put some math behind it as well when we're trying to figure out how to run our regression models. But so it is useful, but it's basically a big cloud of different factors that may come together in various ways over a person's lifetime to produce a particular outcome, diabetes in this case, which is circled here. So my favorite, and not my students' favorite, is of thinking about this is through Rothman's causal pi models. And Rothman is like, he's a superstar, I would say, in epidemiology. He's currently a public health professor at Boston University. And he wrote a very famous book that most of us who are epidemiologists have a love-hate relationship with, called Modern Epidemiology. And partly because there's a lot of formulas in the book. But he argues that there are numerous mechanisms by which a disease occurs. And he describes causality in terms of a pi model, where causes and risk factors are categorized as sufficient, component, and necessary. And so I like to use this example with students, where this was from several years ago, but a group of students on campus asked, is a hot dog a sandwich? And then, data was collected. I don't know how that turned out, but, and I don't have a poll for this, but it would be interesting to see what the audience thought about this question. So, using the Rothman causal pi model to think about this, what is a hot dog? How do you say for sure something is a hot dog or not? As a sufficient cause is a set of conditions without any one of which the disease, in this case, the outcome would not have occurred. So is a bun necessary to produce a hot dog? Is a I think pork or beef-based product necessary? Is ketchup or mustard necessary? It's unclear. And a component cause is any one of the set of conditions, so the bun, the hot dog, or the condiment, which are necessary for completion of of a sufficient cause. And a necessary cause is one that everyone agrees that must be in a hot dog to be a hot dog. And so this can actually produce quite long debates when I've used this definition, or when I've used this example with students. The answer, or maybe the not answer, this actually complicates the question, but it was actually published in the Washington Post by the authors Colbert and Ginsburg. Actually, they didn't answer the question. I think they more or less complicated the question, but they said the cube rule of food. So they divided how to identify different dishes into categories by these different cubes, and they called a hot dog a taco. So they didn't get into what makes a hot dog, but we could go on further to debate whether a hot dog is a taco. I personally don't think it's a taco. So this is how it looks visually when we get back to a more serious subject, like how did someone develop a disease, and how do we think about this as an epidemiologist? pretend that each of these 3 pies are different people, and the whole pie is the sufficient cause of a disease in that person, and it's made up, the pieces are component cause, and the necessary cause is something that's in every single pie. So every person has that factor in their disease development. So Rothman argues in the attributes of the causal pie, he says completion of a sufficient cause is synonymous, so completion of the whole pie is synonymous with occurrence of getting the disease. Component causes can act very far apart in time over a person's lifetime. And a component cause can involve the presence of a causative exposure or lack of a preventative exposure, so one that prevents disease. And blocking the action of any component cause in the sufficient cause prevents the completion of that sufficient cause and therefore prevents disease by that pathway. So here's an example using lung cancer. So we all know that smoking causes an increased risk of lung cancer. But not every person who develops lung cancer is a smoker. So the pie models for each person are different. In one person, it may be that they have smoking in their pie and other unknown component causes. In another person, they may be a non-smoker and have radon and other things that are unknown. And a third person might have asbestos. And then others might have some combination of these factors. So we're trying to determine by looking at people with a condition and without a condition, which factors are more common in those people with a condition. And I think that these pie models provide a useful way to think about that. The final way I will describe of thinking about causality is from the social ecological perspective. And in this perspective, it argues that there are multiple levels at which factors can act to produce or prevent poor health in a population. There are individual level factors such as genetics, knowledge, attitude, skills, biology. There are interpersonal factors, so your family, friends, and social networks, if they tend to smoke or eat unhealthy foods, those can influence your eating patterns as well. There are organizational level factors, so thinking about like your work environment, if it maybe has a program to influence healthy behaviors. And also the same for community or environment in your community. Factors that can influence health at the community level are certainly environmental factors such as trails and parks and those sorts of things. And then finally, at the top level, public policy can also influence health, such as access to health care at all levels, at the state and national and local level. Okay, so that's just a view for some of the ways we think about causality. And then how do we make conclusions about whether something makes a difference in disease development in a population or preventing mortality from a disease? And I find that Hill's guidelines for assessing causality are very useful. So Bradford Hill was famous. He wrote up these guidelines in the British Medical Journal in 1950. And he was famous along with his colleague Richard Dahl for the first case control study, I think, that has been documented. And it was on smoking and carcinoma of the lung. So it was a seminal study showing evidence that people who had lung cancer were much more likely to smoke than people who did not have lung cancer. And I think that influenced his thinking about how should we evaluate the evidence for causality. So in that, he said in 1965, our observations reveal an association between two variables perfectly clear-cut and beyond what we would care to attribute to the play of chance. What aspects of that association should we especially consider before deciding that the most likely interpretation of it is causation? And he came up with 9 different factors to consider. And we're going to go over each of these using lung cancer as an example. The first is strength of association, consistency, specificity, temporality, biological gradient, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analogy. So looking at the evidence for smoking as a cause of lung cancer through the lens of Bradford Hill, strength of association. So we do studies and we measure the incidence of lung cancer in smokers versus non-smokers, for example. And what he says about the strength of association is the stronger an association, the less likely it is to be caused by bias that affects epidemiological studies. And that's several more lectures about bias. The risk of disease is much greater or much less in those exposed than those unexposed. So for smoking and lung cancer, there were several different studies. Here are shown 6 or 7, I think actually it's 7 different large studies that all showed that the relative risk or the incidence of disease in smokers compared to non-smokers was almost 10-fold higher, or between 7 and 15-fold higher. So that's a pretty strong relative risk. We don't usually see relative risks like that unless something is causal in large studies anyway. In small studies, you can get really strong associations that are not causal because you just don't have enough data and you get spurious results. So for consistency, most studies are finding the same thing. So we don't just make cause and effect determination based on one study. We have to see it across several different studies in different populations. And as of 1964, which was the time of the Surgeon General's report that declared smoking as a cause of lung cancer, there were 29 retrospective studies and 7 prospective studies. So it doesn't matter if you understand what retrospective and prospective are, but just understand that there was a lot of studies showing the same things and basically a positive association between smoking and lung cancer. So consistency was met. And specificity of the exposure is specific for a particular health outcome. This doesn't work so well for smoking because it causes a lot of different health outcomes. This works better for infectious disease. So for example, mycobacterium as a cause of tuberculosis. Another criteria is temporality. So the cause must precede the effect. Everyone agrees on this. And study designs vary in their ability to establish temporality. And if you take a class in epidemiology, you will learn all about this. But for tobacco, this graph shows tobacco use and lung cancer death rates in the United States. We definitely see that per capita cigarette consumption started to increase several decades before the lung cancer death rate in males and in females. And we also know from other studies that women took up smoking much later than males as part of I think the Virginia Slims campaign is often credited to getting females to take up smoking. Another argument that Bradford Hill uses is there must be a biologic gradient or dose response. So it depends on the exposure, but the more a person or population is exposed to something, the greater or lesser the incidence of disease. So dose response is illustrated here. We're just looking at the incidence of lung cancer per population. This is measured in person years. But we can see that the incidence of lung cancer from this graph in both men and women is much higher in heavy smokers than in other groups. And it's lowest in never smokers and second lowest in ex-smokers. So as a public health person, it's good to give up smoking if you can. I realize it's really hard. A sixth guideline is plausibility, and this has been well established for smoking and lung cancer. And this means there is a mechanism of action that can explain the relationship between an exposure and an outcome. So the absence of plausibility does not mean that there is no cause and effect relationship, however, because we don't really claim to understand everything yet. But this has been worked out in many different types of studies. Nicotine addiction can cause cigarette smoking all the time, or habitually. And we know that in cigarettes there are carcinogens, which the body does an amazing job of trying to deactivate different carcinogens or different exposures that are native to us. But sometimes they get metabolically activated into something bad, which can form a DNA adduct or a chemical that combines with your DNA. And the body has also evolved to recognize these DNA adducts and repair them, and your DNA then becomes normal again. But that's an imperfect process, and sometimes it doesn't get appropriately repaired. And if the body also has another checkpoint here where apoptosis means that the body says something is wrong with the cell, and the cell it does programmed cell death, but other times that system doesn't work so well, and we get mutations that can cause lung cancer. And you need about 5 to 8 mutations. I think this has been worked out in critical genes to cause lung cancer and other cancers. And these take decades to accumulate that number of mutations. Okay, so our final poll is shown here, and this figure provides an example. This is a different example, but you should have learned hopefully enough to answer the question of which of the below. And I am going to launch the last one. Okay, this one's a little harder. And so the correct answer is A and C, so D. So it gives an example of dose response. As we age, the cancer rate increases. And it also gives an example of strength of association. These are pretty strong associations. I'll just share those results. Okay, so coherence is another guideline. Cause and effect relationships should not be in opposition to known facts. So several things are taken into account when we think about coherence. So for smoking and lung cancer, there was a rapid increase in uptake of cigarette smoking, followed by an increase in lung cancer after a sufficient period of latency. The distribution of lung cancer was consistent with respect to smoking patterns, and there was a decrease in risk among former smokers. So very coherent. Another non-coherent disease relationship is for cell phones and brain tumors, because people have often thought that cell phones were causing brain tumors, but that it's not coherent, because we haven't seen a dramatic rise in brain tumor incidence along with the proliferation of cell phones. And then number 8 is experimental evidence. So this is just saying if we can get evidence from animals that kind of replicate the human situation, that adds to the evidence for causality. So this is just showing exposing rats, again, poor rats, I think, to some carcinogen in cigarette smoking increases their lung cancer incidence. And then finally, analogy is Hill wrote that it would be sometimes acceptable to judge by analogy. He gives the following example: with the effects of thalidomide and rubella before us, we should surely be ready to accept slighter but similar evidence with another drug or another viral disease in pregnancy. So this is probably the weakest one, but it works well for some things, especially for drugs and pregnancy. Okay, the final slide I have, or second to final, is the correlation is not causation. No single study can establish cause and effect, and it's really critically important to evaluate the body of evidence for risk factor associations with disease for policy decisions. They should be made on the preponderance of evidence, as imperfect as it may be. Sometimes bodies who decide about whether something's a carcinogen will say the evidence is insufficient. It is okay to use the causality word. Understand when it is appropriate, though. All right, so that's all I have, and I have left a little bit of time for any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Kim. I know I learned a lot actually from this. It was super interesting. So thank you so much for sharing. We did get a few questions in the chat, and so I'm gonna scroll back up to the first. And you kind of just mentioned that there's a lot of studies out there, and no one can really determine like what causes something from an epidemiological standpoint. But there was a question, if there is, a really profound or eye-opening study that you would recommend the general public to understand, what would that be? A loaded question.
Eye-opening study on any topic.
Yeah.
There's like millions of studies, because there's a lot of epidemiologists and people who practice epidemiology, because you don't have to be licensed. But I mean, I just think some of the historical studies are really well done. The one that I showed there, the Dahl and Hill study on smoking and lung cancer, because it is such a accepted relationship. And it's just a really well done study that sort of opened up the field to many more studies using that study design, tested in different different sort of exposure disease combinations were assessed using that study design. Oftentimes what happens is a lot of small studies are done and they point in a specific direction, because you don't get funding to do that large study until you have some evidence that there might be this exposure might be related to this outcome. And then the really large study that's just published in New England Journal gets done and kind of puts the nail in the coffin, so to speak. Sometimes how we become convinced.
Absolutely. So another question, has anyone developed a software or algorithm to analyze data using the Rothman pi model?
No, I think it's fortunately it's more of a theoretical kind of thought. I kind of envision a population, and each person in that population has a bunch of different pies, and like what is more common in those people who have a disease versus not. Yeah. We do a lot of we have a lot of software. Just that one is just sort of theoretical and pencil and paper.
Sure. And both are good too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another question. There a topic in the news today that you would consider, that is dangerously presenting causality?
Let me think. I mean, on any given day, I mean, just recently, COVID vaccination. I think a lot of people get missed. There are some risks. I think there are some evidence for very, very rare things that happen with the COVID vaccine, but people think that they're more common than they are. Like they don't appreciate how their own risk is probably really small relative to at least getting complications from COVID, at least when we had strains that seem to produce more severe disease. But I think those risks with the vaccine scared a lot of people off from getting the vaccine, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Another like popular story is the whole link between vaccination and autism that was around for a long time. And I think people got scared about vaccinating because of the autism connection, and I think it's still out there to some extent. But that has been disproven in study after study. And the original person who set off the alarm bells on that actually falsified the data. So it wasn't real. I think there were only 12 subjects in his study, if I remember. But once it's out there, it's hard to take back, so.
Yeah, that actually leads to a question that I had too. Because you gave, in that very first example you gave about scurvy and talking about how, back in the 1700s, they did not have the multitude of channels that we have today to disseminate health information. And now we're inundated with information on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And, from an epidemiological standpoint, there are pros to that, but there are definite cons.
Oh, definitely. We're inundated with not only useful information, but misinformation. And so how does someone who maybe doesn't have a really big background in causality and thinking about what's logical and what's consistent, all of the things I just went through, how does someone digest that information that might not be correct? So.
There's probably no good answer for that, but from your perspective, what are some ways that epidemiologists have tried to combat that?
We try to we try to tell people, and I think scientists try to tell people in general to know your sources, where is it a reputable source? Sometimes sources become questionable though when they become politicized, and I won't name any names, so it's really difficult. And I think what I try to do is I try to look at information, knowing how rife with error studies can be sometimes. I try to look at a variety of sources, and try to come to a consensus after kind of reviewing the landscape. I wouldn't just trust one source. So I try to take a holistic approach.
Makes sense. Certainly makes sense. Well, I know we are close to the end of our time. Sarah Sims, anything you'd like to add as we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Dr. Johnson, so much for the presentation and the view into what it can be like if you are a student here at the Brown School taking one of your classes. Just a reminder that a recording of this program, there was a lot of great information, and so if you want to go back and dig into it, a recording of this program will be shared on our YouTube channel. It usually takes us a couple of days to get it up. You can view it there as well as recordings from over 200 past open classroom programs. I'll drop a link in the chat. And we do hope that you continue to learn with us. We have our next curriculum showcase is on Tuesday, February 7th. That will be with Dr. Nancy Morrow Howell, and she is presenting Reframing Aging, Current Perspectives on Older Adults and Aging Society. So I put a link for registration in the chat, and I'll also plug, we are currently in Black History Month, and we have a Black History Month series on Open Classroom, and the next one of those is next Wednesday, February 8th, with Dr. Erica Bumpers, From Darkness to Light, Examining Oppression and Liberation Through Poetry is going to be the title of her talk. So I hope you all continue to join us on Open Classroom and have a great rest of your Thursday. Bye, everyone.